God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. People swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.
Yep. Hello there, HTC. Good morning, Victorville and Apple Valley and Phelan and Hesperia and Classic and hello, the internet. Welcome to church. If you don't have notes, you raise your hand. We'll bring them to you right now. As they're handing those out, I would like to make an official declaration. I'm pretty sure we skipped winter this year. I don't think there's any shot of it happening. I know, man. My wife's a little bit nervous because the winter has been so nice that it's going to be 143 this summer, which is a possibility. Oh man, I would love to tease Laker fans about the number 143, but I don't think I will. Hey, San Diego doesn't even have a basketball team. I'm pathetic. So welcome to church. Last weekend, thank you for coming back, I guess. Last weekend, I think, was the most difficult passage that we could cover in the New Testament. But I know for some folks it's because they think it means different things than what others do. But the bottom line is it's a very severe calling for us to keep following after Jesus, which is a good thing anyway. And where we land today is why we should be following after Jesus anyway. It's not actually any doom and gloom this week. It's the heartfelt call to a promise giver that is worth believing. It's the heartfelt call to a promise giver who can back up what he says. It's the heartfelt call to a dad who takes care of his kids. And so this weekend, we're going to finish up Hebrews chapter 6. So you open your Bibles there if you could. You can get your notes ready. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13, just about through the end of the chapter. Next weekend, Pastor Tom is going to pick up the very last few words of this chapter and launch into 7. But I'm going to read you guys the first 3 verses of our passage today. Hebrews 6, 13, 14, and 15 say that when God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. These 3 verses introduce the big idea for the weekend and the tension of the weekend as well. Write this down in your notes. God's promise anchored Abraham, period. That's the big idea for the weekend. Sometimes we build to the big idea. This weekend we begin with it. And the idea is that when God said to Abraham, held him together. And that's really the idea that the book of Hebrews is going to. Our theme for this entire series is hold fast. Remain steady, keep on keeping on, because what God promises you is enough for you to hold on to. And so the first 2 verses of this introduce the idea that God gave a promise and God fulfills the promise. God confirms the promise by using himself as the point of reference. And it's kind of a weird way to say it, because when you and I try and validate something we're saying, we bring someone else into the conversation. When you're talking with your kids, you're like, so help me when your dad gets home, so help me when mom hears about this. We're trying to bring ourselves credibility by way of someone else. But it's interesting, this passage introduces the idea when God told Abraham, hey, here's how it's going to be, so help me. He's saying, there is nothing more certain in this world than I can say to you other than I said it. And that's as secure as it gets. So that's generally what the idea that we're going to talk about is. But the last verse that I just read to you guys, verse 15, is an interesting conflict. in all of this, because verse 15 says, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. Well, that's a very interesting thing to say, because the book of Hebrews later on, when it's revisiting the person of Abraham, is actually going to go out of his way to explain, by the way, you know the funny thing about Abraham and his walk with God? Abraham didn't get what God promised him. As a matter of fact, he died believing the promise of God without ever having seen it. So, okay, wait a second. What's going on? Is the God who gives me a promise trustworthy, or is he going to make me a promise that I'm never going to see the benefits of? Because if I'm going to get up off the floor of the grocery store, as you know, we said last week, and keep following him through life, what am I looking for? A God who promises things, or the actual fulfillment of the promises that he gives? So we're going to introduce a few things. I'm going to share with you a personal story about how I weigh these two things out and the conflict therein. And if we're all lucky, maybe we'll talk about a long-lost prince of Burkina Faso, okay? So let's look at the promise God gave to Abraham, okay? Let's examine some highlights of what that is, and those ingredients are gonna build us towards a landing point this weekend. First thing I want you to write down about the promise God gave to Abraham is this, is that it's one promise blessed by God. The Abrahamic covenant is found in the book of Genesis. And, when God spoke to Adam and Eve and he said, here's how we're going to interact together, and they bailed on God, and so he gave them a new way to handle life. And then their boys bailed, one of their boys at least, bailed on walking with God, killed his brother, and so God sent him away. And then Noah comes around, and so many people had bailed on a walk with God that he flooded the earth. That's how he dealt with it. And then time goes on, and you've got the nations gathering at Babel, trying to build themselves a tower to heaven, and they're bailing on God, and God confuses their language. By the way, an effective method of messing with people so that they wouldn't build away from God, because to this day, national lines are still absolutely lines of division. And then we get to Genesis chapter 12. And I think God has allowed people to keep walking away from him, and him doing things to try and stop them from walking too far away. And he changes his tactic and he says, you know what? I'm going to speak into the life of someone. I'm going to choose Abram. And Abram, I'm going to call out, and I'm going to make a covenant with him. And the ingredients in this covenant are what we're looking at this weekend. We've already established that it's one promise blessed by God. I want to read you 3 verses in Genesis 12. This is the beginning of that covenant between God and Abram. Verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, go from your people, go from your house to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, if you were to pick one word in those 3 verses that you thought was the most important word, you would probably pick Barak, blessing. Because God says, okay, I'm gonna bless you as an individual, Abram. And the reason I'm gonna do that, well, because I've called you away from your land, your people, your home, your family. And so you're gonna need someone to take care of you. If I'm calling you to follow me, then I'm gonna be the one that's gonna take care of you as you do that. So over and over in Genesis chapter 12, God says, I'm gonna bless you, Abram. As a matter of fact, my blessing is gonna pour onto you so that it splatters. And as you interact with different people, they're gonna be taken care of too. And so it's almost as if, like a dad was filling his son's backpack with so much candy for camp that as he walks into his cabin at camp, candy is just spilling out everywhere. And all of his buddies are like, dude, thank you for staying in this cabin. We're gonna be hopped up on sugar all week. Not that that happens at camp, but it does. And then from there, the Bible expands and it says, as a matter of fact, as different people come towards you, it's not just where you go, but as people come towards you, if they're watching out for you, man, as they leave, just blessing is gonna follow them. As a matter of fact, The whole world is going to be blessed through you, Abram. And then here's Abram, just sitting in his dad's front tent and just taking care of normal Chaldean life. And he says, okay. That's what Abram says. He says, okay. The first ingredient is that the blessing of God is involved in the promise of God. Now I know that there are an awful lot of believers that can just turn God into a vending machine or a lucky rabbit's foot. Something that if you text this number that you'll get, some magic coupon. And I know that God should be treated with the sense of respect, that God should be treated with a sense of sobriety. But can we also just say that God is saying that he'll bless his kids? And I know this is just Tim, this isn't saying all his kids, he's saying Abram. I know that. But don't forget that this is spoken of in larger in the book of Hebrews. Why would he be so in our face last week saying, keep following, keep following, keep following, keep following? Because he believes that this promise to Abram echoes into our lives as well. And I think that we need to affirm that God blesses his kids. Now, the second ingredient I want you to write down is that it's one promise initiated by God. It's the blessing of God, but it's also the initiation of God that is important here. When I moved to the desert 14 years ago, my wife and I had both lived in big, expensive cities to live in. And so one of the earliest memories I have of living here in the desert is we used to shop in the Albertsons over by Eagle Ranch that is no longer in existence, okay? And when you walked in the front door, there were those little magazine racks with the for sale homes, brochures. And I remember looking through those and thinking, wow, this is cool. There's lots of homes available in the desert. And I was always confused by what I didn't know then, but I know now, was the price of the homes. Because coming from San Diego to here, the number 81,000 didn't make sense to me like that. That's how much money a house costs, like $81,000. 81000, is that the serial number for this? That's the listing number? But this house is also 81000, and that house is 81000. What is going on here? And we learned that houses were that affordable. And we've all seen them go this, whatever. So my wife and I decided that we wanted to buy a home here in the desert. Well, buying a home, I learned, is about as complicated as signing treaty papers at the end of World War II. Because it's not just me as a buyer going to the owner and saying, I want to buy your house. It's me going to a bank and saying, hey, I found a house that I like. Can I have a lot of money so that you can give, not the owner, but their bank all the money so that their bank can tell that owner, okay, you're good. You can leave this house. And then my bank is saying, okay, good, you can move into the house. Technically, we own it, but you can live there for a while. You keep paying us money. So I'm signing papers on behalf of my bank. I'm signing papers on behalf of that bank. There's an escrow agency that's going to oversee the legality of it. We got real estate agents on both sides. There are appraisers. Their bank needs papers signed. It's all these different parties coming to the table, and we're all agreeing, here's my role in the contract. And I'm signing to say that I will back it up. The Abrahamic covenant is nothing like an escrow exchange. The Abrahamic covenant is decidedly different from the perspective of God, that the promise he makes to Abraham, I'm gonna give you a blessing of people, I'm gonna give you a blessing of land, I'm gonna give you a blessing of promise. And all these things, Abraham, I just need you to just move into the house. The initiation of this is squarely on the shoulders of God. He's the one that's decided. So Genesis 12 introduces the Abrahamic covenant. God goes back to Abraham, at this point, still Abram, in Genesis 15. And the first 21 verses of the chapter are all just a rehashing of the promise. And there's an interesting verse 7, chapter 15. God also said to him, I am the Lord, I who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. I will give you this land to take possession of it. God is pointing out to him, Abram, by the way, I didn't pick you because you were in church one Sunday morning. I didn't pick you because you went to a harvest crusade. I didn't pick you because you were teaching other people the story of creation. I didn't pick you because you are learning how to make sacrifices to me. I picked you because I picked you. You were living in Ur, in your dad's house. His name is Terah. You weren't even the head of the house. I picked you. I saw you. I chose you. I want you. And the initiation of God into this covenant is an important distinction that is made both in Genesis and the New Testament as well. As a matter of fact, it's this initiation of God, it's this blessing of God that we are able to plumb the depths of the importance of what Abram did in all this. Paul speaks about Abram's response and he says, Abram believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abram's backpack got filled with blessing because Abram said, okay. Abram was given righteousness because he said, okay. Abram got to move into the new house because he said, okay. And that's very important this weekend because the distinction is made that Abram is blessed because of God. Abram gets a promise because of God. Abram has a future because of God. As a matter of fact, the third ingredient I want you to write down is that it's one promise validated by God. The chapter goes on and there are two verses I'm going to read to you. Let me explain the setting first because it's kind of a weird story. So there's this covenant going to be made. It's all these people at the table, okay, signing escrow papers. Except that the way that they're going to do it is not through legal contracts, but that some sacrifices were made in Genesis 15, okay? Animals were slaughtered, they're separated out, and a half of an animal were laid on different sides. It created a pathway. And it was the way that you could make a contract in the old world is that animals are sacrificed and then you passed through them saying, you and I, as we pass through these sacrifices, are making an oath on the life of these animals that were spilled. You and I are entering into an agreement. Except it doesn't happen that way with this covenant. Verse 12 says, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep. If you go to sign papers for a house, don't fall asleep. And a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Who moves through the covenant? Not Abram. He's asleep. God moves through. And he says, I'm validating this. It's an important distinction that this passage is making. He's saying, God confirmed on an oath swearing by himself. So help me, I promise this. Not your mom, not your dad, not by virtue of my signature, not putting my hand on a Bible in a courtroom, by me. I am the person of God. And everything in creation is only derivative of me. It's only reflective of me to begin with. So what else is there that I could swear by that would convince you that I'm trustworthy? The stars, they're subject to me. They eventually will burn out. The earth, it is subject to me. If I withhold my breath, it ceases to spin. So I promise you, Abraham, according to me. That's what I want you to trust in. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to initiate all this. I'm going to validate this. And these three things together, guys, work together to say these two things. That the promise of God is for his glory. It's his initiation. It's his validation. All things exist for the glory of God. And I think that's the safe, correct church answer to say, why would God do this? Because it's for his glory. But I want to say concurrently, from the perspective of the book of Hebrews, from the perspective of Genesis 12, 15, eventually 17, that the promise was for the glory of God and for the good of God's people as well. These two ideas are what now create the tension that we're going to explore. That God's promise that he wants you to get off the floor of the grocery store and move towards him is about his glory, but he wants you to get up because it's also for your good. He wants to bless you. He wants to bless the people around you. He wants to bless the world through us as well. And so now these ideas are going to be held in tension and we're going to move on. I'm going to read the next two verses from Hebrews 6. 17 and 18 say that because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear. Excuse me, wait a second. Am I reading the right verses? Yes, I am. Okay. Sometimes you just need a minute, and I had mine. Very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. Oh, now I know what I did wrong. I skipped verse 16, didn't I? Okay, we got this. Let's do this again. No big deal. Verse 16. People swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. That's the contract. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. That was harder than it looked. Write this down. This is the next big point in our notes. God's promise is anchored to himself. Let's talk about Burkina Faso. So back in the early days of the internet, a scam used to happen. I don't think it's happened that often lately, but there was lots of different variations of it, and it all kind of used to go like this. You got an email, and it said, greetings, festival greetings, hello, and good tidings. I am, so-and-so, and a legitimate prince of the Mossi people of Burkina Faso, but I have been swindled from my fortune. I have $760,000 that I need to reclaim as my own, and I need your help. All I need is your bank's routing number and your account number so that I can move these US dollars back into a secure location. And as a thank you to you, I will give you 10% of my fortune. And you're reading it and you're going, what? Now, I know there's variations. Some versions, it's, a Nigerian princess. Some versions, it's something else. It's a duke of, Ferdinand. But the variation is this. There's someone giving you a promise, and there's the promise made to you. And I don't know how any of these emails ever worked. But they must have, right? That's why that we got so many of them. Why else would you have received emails from princesses and princes from around the world asking you just for all I need is complete and full access to your banking information. And then I'll be able to secure my legacy and a fortune, and I'll give you 10% of it as well. Now, the bottom line logic of how this promise works is this, is that I, an individual, promise you this big thing. And it's almost like what magicians say, that the big action covers the small action. And if I'm a magician trying to convince you I've done something tricky, then I'm gonna do something big and splashy so that all of you watch this. Meanwhile, I'm pulling something out of my pocket down here and magically, oh look, this appeared. That's what the email is, right? It's this big, flashy promise, money, so that you're not paying attention to the fact that this individual is not legitimate. Big promise, pay no attention to this. This passage and these two verses are saying the opposite. When you're holding two things in tension, a big, huge, overwhelming promise, it's more important for you to pay attention to the person, because the person is more secure than the promise they offer. There are a couple of verses I want to read to you guys. One is from Numbers 23. And it's the story of Balaam's donkey, and it's a longer story than just that actually, but the statement is made and it says that God is not human that he should lie. He's not a human being that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? The Bible affirms early on in human history, listen, there's something you can bank on, and that is the person of God. The words of God are tied to his character. So when he says something, he knows not only what the situation is now, but what the situation will be later as well. It's one of the struggles we have with our spouse or our kids, right? We always want to say things that we want to be true in the future, that we hope are true in the future. Oh, when we're on spring break, I'll take you kids to Disneyland. And then you get to spring break and you look at your banking account and then you see how many US dollars it takes to get into Disneyland, and you're like, kids, we're gonna need a lost Mossi Prince of Burkina Faso to get into Disneyland, because I don't think, God's not like that. When he says something now, he's aware of the situation now, and he's aware of what the situation will be then, and so when he says it, it's bankable. He's not a person that he would lie. He's not a man that he's gonna say something and not follow through on it. He's different than that. As a matter of fact, later in the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, it says the famous quote, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There's a bankability of God. Okay, so we've got two contrasts, two pairs. There's the glory of God and the good of his people, And the second thing is there's a promise he makes and there's him himself. And I think these two things create a tension in us as believers, because I think it would be very easy to leave church this weekend and say, okay, Tim, I'm good with this passage saying, hey, believe in the person of God more than the promises that you see or don't see. I think we'd understand that that is a good Bible church thing to believe, but let's put it into real life. And I wanted to share a couple different stories with you guys this week about people who've been through difficulty, and they've got the promise of God, but they're not seeing it. They've got the promise of God, but they don't get right now how it's for the good of them. Maybe, sure, I get it's good for God, but I don't see how it's good for me. But I didn't feel comfortable sharing someone else's story. So I'm actually going to share a story about my life that you already know, but I want to look at it from a different angle. The story of gaining a daughter and losing her for 2 years and gaining her back again. It's really easy to see how that's a promise of God. Sort of like, man, God, you are so good. Like the glory of God was shown through that story, right? In my life and in the life of the people I shared it with. It's easy to see that because it demonstrates that God's character is strong enough to know that he can bring back from the dead metaphorically, that he's redemptive, that he can undo what's been lost, that he can reclaim things. But can I be very carnal right now? That there have been an awful lot of moments where I haven't seen how it's for my good that he told my story that way. I don't get it. Because we started off following God the same way God said, Abraham, follow. We said, okay, we'll care for widows and orphans. We'll do that. I'll change the world, and I'm not just gonna talk about it. So we bring this girl into our home, and then she's gone. And it's not just that she was gone back to, yay, okay, that situation was all taken care of. And I know it was hard for you guys, but this is better. It got worse. In the 2 years she was gone, she was in weird situations and learned awful habits and was out of place in the flow of a normal human life. And then all of a sudden she's dropped back into my home. And guys, please understand, stay with me till the end here. It's as if a grenade was dropped in my family because it's not the same path that we were on. I didn't get to just keep obeying God and care for her from the time she was a baby till she was a 5-year-old girl. There are some weird things that we had to deal with as a family. And to be honest, as I look at my story, I get how it's for the glory of God that happened. No problem. Sometimes what I struggle with, how is this for our good? Because I don't know. Now the reason I feel the boldness to share that is because Abram had the same struggle. It's interesting, the reason God spoke to Abram again in chapter 15 is because he hadn't fulfilled the promise yet. He just said, hey, Abram, remember me. I said all these things. If you're dealing with the who and the what, be more preoccupied with the who. If some weird random dude sends you an email saying that this is the awesome promise, pay more attention to the who than the what. That's smart. And Abram, I want you to pay attention to me. But you know what? Sometimes Abram struggled. You know what? Sometimes I struggle. You know what? I think this is the point of what Hebrews in this challenging section has been. I think sometimes you struggle with the promise of God on your life, but you're like, man, I am not seeing it. I don't see how God is fulfilling these things. Tim, last week, you were real clear and all in my face about, okay, I want God to be blessed and be a blessing through my finances. Tim, I went back home and I'm like, God, you've got it. And I logged onto my bank account and I was ready for it to be big enough for me to give, and it wasn't. It was the same normal bank account. Tim, I went back home and I'm like, you know what, God, I do want you involved and to be a blessing and be blessed through my marriage. And I went back home and my spouse was still a dummy. They were not like suddenly godly. Tim, I wanted to bring God into my world and my purpose of oikos and world change. But man, I wanted to go home and see my neighbors just crying on the front porch and you were so right. We were so wrong. And you know what? We're coming to your church and we're going to join your small group and we're going to give you our car because you were, but they didn't. None of that happened. And it's the struggle of, okay, I see that all these things are for your glory, God, but man, your promise to Abram said that you were going to bless him. The book of Hebrews says that I'm supposed to get up and keep following you so I can enter into your rest. I don't see how this is for my good. And if I'm going to hold your promise and you in hand, I think the warning of Hebrews is that we start to forget more and more about who he is, and we're just looking for these things to just be fixed. I just want it fixed. God, where's the promise? Where's the promise? Where's the promise? And this is saying between the two, if your eyes can't see both, I'm telling you, choose this one. Choose the person of God and his consistent character, his trustworthiness, above what you do or don't see in the world of promise. I'm going to read the last two verses to you, and I'm going to get them right this time. We're going to read verses 18 and 19. 18 says this: God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. The passage ends with this, saying, okay, I'm aware that there's a struggle between the promise of God and the person of God. And in every situation in life, always choose the trustworthiness of the person. This isn't just a Sunday school lesson. This is a life lesson. If you're offered something amazing, trust the source more than the promise. And if the source is trustworthy, go with it. And so this says, man, we are fleeing to the hope that God gives us. In what? Yeah, in the promise, absolutely. I do not, as a pastor, and the Bible does not back off that God will bless you, but he says, throw your anchor onto the person of Jesus, who goes into the inner sanctuary. This verse says that he goes behind the curtain and is an anchor for your hope. Behind the curtain is a reference again to Judaism and the courts and the temple, all these different areas. And as you got tighter and tighter, there was this Holy of Holies, and only one person could go there one time a year because that's representative of where the presence of God was. And the author is saying, you throw your anchor on Jesus because he goes directly to God, and that will hold you together. So Abram is struggling with the promise. And he's struggling with the fact that God has said all these things, but he has none of it. He doesn't have a land. He doesn't have a family. He doesn't even have a kid. And so as Abram is wandering, man, he messes up a couple times. He goes into this kingdom and he's worried that the king of the kingdom is going to see past him to his woman. And his wife apparently was good looking, so good looking that Abram was worried that he was going to get killed so that his wife could become part of this kingdom. So he goes in and he's like, follow my lead. He goes in and he introduces his wife as his sister. Man, if you want to make your wife grumpy, go to a party and introduce her as your sister. That was a dumb thing to do. It showed no faith. That wasn't godly. It's what Abram did. Why? Because he was struggling in that moment between the person of God and the promise of God, and he didn't see this happening. And so he did something dumb. It's not the only dumb thing he did. He was struggling with the person of God and the promise of God, and he didn't see this happening, and there was no land, and there was no family. God, everything I gave up, you said you would give back to me. Everything I left, you said I would walk to, and I don't have any of it. So I'm gonna sleep with this other woman, and that's gonna fix it. And he got her pregnant, and that lady had a son, and it bothered his wife. There's a shocker. Gentlemen, you wanna make your wife angry? Call her your sister and get another woman pregnant. This is good advice in church today. And he struggled, and he struggled, and he struggled. When did he struggle? When he was fixed on the promise of God more than the person of God. I'm sorry, guys, this isn't a cliche church phrase. This is the history of people walking with God. Thousands of years. And you're right, if you're a little bit surprised, Well, Tim, how could you say that about your daughter? I'm sorry. I'm thrilled she's back. I'm not questioning her. I'm questioning if God is doing this the way I want him to. Because the promise of God to me looks different than what it looked like in my mind when I signed up. And so what I say here to end is God's promise can anchor you to hope. It absolutely can. But I think you need to decide that who you believe in is worth more than what you believe in him for. Because the story of Abram, I know how that ends. Gosh, man, chapter 17, God goes to Abram again. And he says, Abram, remember the promise? And Abram says, yeah, I remember the promise. I've got none of it. Cool. Well, here's what I want to do right now. I want to change your name. And I'm going to call you Abraham. Because Abram isn't even big enough for what I'm going to do in your life. You see, Abram means father. Abraham means father of many, father of much, much father. And that's what I want you to be called, because Abram, you don't even know what I'm going to do through you. You're going to have a son, and then that son is going to have a son, and then that son is going to have 12 sons. And then those 12 sons, they're going to mess with one of them, and that one son is going to move into Egypt. And then that one son is going to bring the other 11 back into Egypt, and I'm going to protect them. I'm going to prosper them while they're in Egypt. And then while they're in Egypt, I'm going to send a deliverer, and he's going to lead them out of Egypt into the land that I promised you. Hundreds of years later. But that's cool, because now through those people, I'm going to establish a line that I'm going to protect. I'm going to reaffirm what I said to you through David. I'm going to reaffirm it through different kings. I'm going to keep a remnant of faith alive so that someday, maybe around the year 0, I'm going to bring forth the son, and he's going to be so spectacular that he will turn the hearts of people back to God. He's going to give them righteousness, life, and hope, and he's going to echo back out to the whole known world, so much so that a pokey little church in the desert of Victorville is going to have a global reach, and they're going to see things happen like a tribal village be introduced to my son through their faithfulness. Abram, I'm going to do things through your life that are remarkable, so I can't call you Abram. I need to call you Abraham. And in that moment, Abram's like, God, I don't see any of it, but I say, okay. I will keep following. And I know I've screwed up, but I'm going to keep following. And I know I don't get it, but I'm going to keep following, because when I don't see how it's for my good, I'm going to trust that it's for your glory. When I don't see the promise being fulfilled, I'm going to trust the person who did it. That's how I've chosen to deal with what's happened in my life. That when in these moments, God, I don't see how it's for my good. So I'm going to choose that my story is about your glory. And I'm going to keep walking and be confused and probably screw some things up. And bigger than the misreading of verses, I'm going to keep walking, keep walking, keep walking. Because if I don't understand this, I'm going to make sure I've got you. And that's the point of the whole book. And it's the calling this weekend for you to grab onto your dad through prayer, through worship, through reading, through church attendance, through podcasts, through whatever. But that you hold on to your father, because bad decisions in your past do not disqualify you from hope for your future. And HDC, I know that American culture has so many things to offer us. Holy cow, so many things to make your life better. I'm going to tell you that your life is for his glory, and it's also for your good. And when you can't see both, his glory anchors you. He has a promise. I believe it for your life. I don't shy away from that. But sometimes when I don't see it, I choose to hold on to the promise giver, because I understand that more. And that's what we got a shot to do this week. Let's pray. God, you are good. And Lord, a lot of times I need to start my prayers with that you are good, you know all things, you have all power. And so God, with those 3 things intact, I just choose to believe. And I keep walking. And God, I confess to you that there are times where I care less about where you are, and I just become preoccupied with what I think the promise needs to be. But Father, I pray that you'd help me to center myself, to flee towards hope in your Son, to throw my anchor over his shoulder and have him drag me into your presence. God, I pray for us as a church. Teach us through this book that we need to actively do things to make this happen. And it's our choice to follow. It's my choice to read. It's my choice to pray. It's my choice to obey. And God, I pray that as we do these things, God, I pray that you would bless in a way that makes sense to you, for us. God, we trust you with the blessing. We'll do the following. And if you're in the room this weekend, you've never given your life to him, can I invite you to be blessed by God through his Son, Jesus? I don't know what it'll practically mean in your life in terms of setting your finances straight or your health straight. I don't know. But I do know that God says he wants to bless. And for you to make that happen, you've got to choose to follow him as well. How do I follow an unseen God? Well, at High Desert, we explain it this way. That you admit right now in your heart, and as you pray silently, God, I admit I have sinned and I need you in my life. And I believe that Jesus is the solution. And so God, I choose to follow. And at HTC, we would rejoice with you that you would be blessed by God in the same way he's blessed us. God, you are good and you are worthy to be followed. So raise us up to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.